You assume cowboys strolled into saloons purely for whiskey? Reconsider that notion. These frontier watering holes dished out some of the most unusual, hearty, and unexpected meals on the western frontier. From deep-fried cattle testicles to sourdough flapjacks tucked in saddlebags, these aren't campfire legends. They're authentic dishes served to genuine gunslingers throughout the American West. Let's explore 25 cowboy recipes you never realized were actually featured on Wild West saloon menus. 1. Son of a gun stew. It appeared to be a jest until you witnessed what was truly in it. Son of a gun stew was the quintessential don't inquire, just consume dish on the American frontier, and indeed, it was authentically served in saloons throughout cattle towns from Dodge City to Abilene. Its roots go back to cattle drives, where cowboys slaughtered livestock while traveling and utilized every portion of the animal, not merely from reverence, but from necessity. Waste meant weakness. This stew incorporated organ meats such as tripe, heart, liver, marrow gut, sweetbreads, and even brain, all slow-cooked in a rich, spicy broth with potatoes, onions, and occasionally carrots or wild seasonings. In certain areas, it served as a test of manhood. A cowboy's strength wasn't judged by his quick draw, but by his ability to finish an entire bowl. What made it a saloon favorite? Simple, it was substantial, calorie-dense, and inexpensive. Cattle towns at civilization's edge lacked access to premium cuts, but they possessed innards, flames, and cast iron. And for trail-weary cowboys, a steaming bowl of son-of-a-gun stew represented survival, even when it came with a helping of unidentified meat. 2. Sourdough flapjacks. Before energy bars and roadside breakfasts, cowboys relied on flapjacks, large, flat, skillet-fried pancakes crafted from naturally cultured sourdough starter that some transported in containers secured to their saddlebags. They weren't merely sustenance, they were a frontier custom, and cooks protected their starters like precious metal. The mixture was combined with water, flour, and salt, no sweetener, and cooked in bacon fat until golden at the edges and tender within. The tangy flavor resulted from weeks or even months of fermentation. These flapjacks were thick, chewy, and satisfying, frequently served by saloons with molasses, pork fat, or preserved fruit if the proprietor had railroad access. In saloons, flapjacks were available morning, afternoon, or late night, depending on who wandered in and how long they'd been traveling. Some dubbed them sinkers because they landed in your belly like stone, but they sustained you, which was precisely the intention. These weren't delicate breakfast treats. These were survival carbohydrates, cooked in cast iron and designed to carry you through a shootout or a 10-mile journey in the bitter cold. And the finest part? The final one on the dish always received the extra dollop of syrup, assuming any remained. 3. Fried salt pork and beans. No meal represents Wild West quite like a serving of beans, but fried salt pork and beans was beyond a stereotype. It was the cornerstone of frontier existence, served in virtually every saloon west of the Mississippi. Salt pork, a fatty preserved cut cured in heavy salt solution, was shelf-stable and could endure harsh months in containers without refrigeration. Saloons would cut it thick, fry it in its own grease until browned and crispy, then ladle it over slow-cooked beans, typically pinto or navy beans that had been boiled for hours over gentle heat. Molasses, onions, and lard were typical additions, but when provisions ran low, you simply had pork grease and beans, and you can be certain it was tasty. Include a chunk of day-old sourdough or cornbread, and you possessed a meal that could sustain a cowboy riding from sunrise to sunset. Beans were served by the bowl, the dish, or straight from the skillet, often directly from the cook's fire to the counter. Some saloons even offered them around the clock, because nobody who worked livestock wanted to drink on an empty gut. 4. Chuck wagon coffee. Some labeled it six-shooter brew. Others dubbed it liquid pitch. But every cowboy understood that chuck wagon coffee wasn't merely a beverage. It was the essence of the trail. Brewed strong enough to support a horseshoe, coffee was frequently made in weathered tin vessels using coarse grounds tossed directly into boiling water. To settle the grounds, trail cooks added eggshells, crushed beans, or, in certain instances, a dash of salt or even a strip of rawhide. Saloons typically maintained a black pot on the heat all day, refilled every few hours but seldom cleaned. You could enter, place a coin or speck of gold dust on the bar, and receive a steaming tin cup of pitch-black coffee that served as both conversation starter and hangover remedy. Cowboys consumed it before breakfast, after poker, and sometimes in place of sleep. And if fortune smiled, the bartender might add a splash of whiskey to improve the taste. 5. Prairie oysters, Rocky Mountain oysters. No compilation of saloon cuisine would be complete without the most notorious delicacy of the Old West, prairie oysters, also recognized today as Rocky Mountain oysters. Despite the title, they're not marine food. They're deep-fried bull testicles served hot and crispy following cattle roundups and brandings. Cowboys didn't squander meat, not even the portions most people would prefer to forget. After the cattle were castrated, a vital part of ranching, the organs were cleaned, sliced, coated in flour and spices, and plunged into hot fat. Saloons in Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas served them fresh, frequently during branding celebrations or beef days. They were accompanied by hot sauce, vinegar, mustard, or simply eaten plain, washed down with beer or rye. You didn't consume prairie oysters to be sophisticated. You ate them to demonstrate you were tough, local, and proud. And in certain towns, declining a plate was an effective way to get mocked out of the establishment. 6. Rabbit stew. In the Wild West, when beef was too costly or scarce, cowboys relied on what they could hunt, and that frequently meant rabbit. Light, lean, and abundant on the plains, rabbit was a favorite among both chuck wagon cooks and saloon kitchens that served working-class travelers. Rabbit stew was prepared with whatever was on hand: potatoes, onions, carrots, and sometimes turnips or wild herbs. The meat was first seared in pork fat or tallow, then slow-simmered until tender enough to separate from the bone. It wasn't elegant. It was frontier rustic at its best. Some saloons in New Mexico and Arizona even served rabbit stew seasoned with chilies, cumin, and garlic, blending cowboy cuisine with nearby Mexican and native culinary traditions. The outcome was hearty, warming, and surprisingly rich. It wasn't a dish for outlaws or gamblers. Rabbit stew was for cowhands who'd been in the saddle all week, weary of hardtack and beans, and ready for something that reminded them of a home they hadn't visited in years. 7. Squirrel fricacy. Indeed, squirrel. In the frontier era, squirrel meat was not only accepted, it was anticipated. Affordable, plentiful, and surprisingly tasty, squirrel became a saloon staple in wooded regions from Missouri to Arkansas, particularly when cattle was too expensive. Fricassee, a technique inherited from European settlers, meant the squirrel was lightly pan-seared, then braised in gravy, often made from the drippings, flour, and milk. The result was tender meat in a creamy, peppery sauce, served over biscuits or cornbread. This dish wasn't promoted on a sign outside. It was something you learned about through the back entrance or from the bartender. Squirrel fricassee was a local's meal, evidence that saloons weren't just whiskey establishments. They were community kitchens for people who knew how to maximize whatever moved in the trees. 8. Corn Dodger biscuits. Cowboys didn't always possess yeast, but they had cornmeal, and that was sufficient. Corn dodgers were dense, hand-shaped biscuits made by combining cornmeal, boiling water, a pinch of salt, and sometimes bacon drippings or pork grease. Formed into ovals or patties, they were fried, baked on stones by the fire, or crisped in skillets. In saloons, cooks would enhance them with a spoonful of molasses or serve them alongside beans and stew. The texture was gritty, the flavor smoky and mildly sweet, and they could survive for days in a saddlebag without spoiling, making them trail-friendly as well. Some even wrapped them in fabric to store in bedrolls overnight, ready for reheating at dawn. In saloon culture, corn dodgers were side staples, like bread rolls in a contemporary diner. But to the cowboy, they were a reminder of home and hunger, satisfied with determination and determination alone. 9. Pickled eggs. You've witnessed them in old-fashioned saloon films, murky glass containers filled with pale, floating eggs sitting on dusty bars. That's no movie prop. Pickled eggs were a genuine cowboy snack, particularly for those too broke or too busy to order a full meal. Saloons prepared them in large batches. Boiled eggs soaked in a brine of vinegar, salt, mustard seed, peppercorns, garlic, and sometimes beet juice or chili peppers for color and heat. After marinating for days or weeks, they became sour, salty, spicy protein packages. No utensil required. Just grab, crack, and consume. They were frequently sold for a few pennies, served on the bar beside a tin of salt or hot sauce. Some saloons paired them with beer or whiskey, a kind of Old West happy hour special. Today, pickled eggs might seem like an afterthought, but in 1870, on a trail halfway to nowhere, they were as close to fast food as you could find. 10. Hardtack and gravy. Hardtack, also called toothbreakers or molar chippers, was a survival biscuit made from flour, water, and salt. Baked until bone dry and frequently harder than the blade used to cut it, hardtack was designed to last years, not days. But saloons knew how to ease the impact. They'd take chunks of hardtack, soak them in water or broth, and cover them in hot pan gravy, typically made from salt pork drippings, flour, and pepper. Some added chopped onions or a bit of bacon for extra richness. To the cowboy, this was a taste of civilization after a week of gnawing bark-like trail rations. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, filling, and, once drenched in gravy, even somewhat comforting. In many ways, this dish captures the entire story of cowboy cuisine. Make do, don't waste, and never underestimate the power of a good pan of grease. 11. Buffalo roast. In the early years of westward expansion, before cattle ranches were widespread, buffalo reigned supreme. Plains bison roamed in the millions, and frontier saloons, particularly those near railways or hunting camps, frequently served roasted buffalo meat as a premium dish. The meat was lean, dark, and deeply flavorful, more similar to venison than beef. Saloons roasted large cuts over open flame pits or in cast iron ovens basted with animal fat, salt, and herbs when available. The most coveted cut, the hump roast, incredibly tender when cooked slowly. Buffalo was frequently sliced thin and served with gravy or a side of potatoes. And if you were in a mining boomtown, buffalo could cost more than beef, not because it was scarce, but because demand was so high. Buffalo roast was a status meal. Only the finest saloons offered it, and cowboys who could afford it frequently ordered it to celebrate a big victory or a big bounty. Ironically, the popularity of this dish helped drive the buffalo to near extinction by the late 1800s. But for a time, buffalo roast was the centerpiece of the frontier banquet. 12. Biscuits and molasses. Simple, sticky, satisfying. For cowboys too exhausted to eat meat and too poor for eggs, biscuits and molasses were a blessing. Biscuits were made from flour, lard, salt, and water, or sour milk, no yeast, no sugar. Baked quickly in a Dutch oven or skillet, they emerged crispy on the outside and flaky inside. Saloon kitchens kept them ready throughout the day. Molasses, thick, dark, and shelf-stable, was poured on top like frontier syrup. It wasn't just a treat. It was frontier fuel, providing cowboys a dose of sugar and carbs after long rides or before heading back to the trail. In some saloons, biscuits and molasses were even served as dessert, especially when fruit or pie ingredients weren't available. But the real reason this dish endured? It tasted like home, particularly for cowboys raised in the South, where molasses and biscuits were a childhood memory in every bite. 13. Fried calf brains. You won't discover this one on modern menus, but back in the Wild West, nothing was wasted, particularly not in a saloon that needed to feed travelers on a tight budget. So when a steer was butchered, brains were cleaned, sliced, battered, and fried until crisp and golden. Served with mustard, onions, or hot sauce, fried calf brains were considered a delicacy in some towns, particularly in places with heavy German, French, or Mexican influence, where offal was more culturally accepted. The texture? Creamy inside, crunchy outside. The flavor? Mild, almost like eggs. Cowboys who grew up poor didn't hesitate. They knew, if it was fried, it was fair game. Some saloons even served it with eggs and bread for a kind of frontier brain breakfast. It might sound shocking now, but back then, it was intelligent cooking. 14. Game jerky. Venison, elk, antelope. Jerky wasn't just trail food, it was saloon food too. When hunters returned from the wilderness, they brought smoked and dried strips of venison, elk, or antelope, which saloons purchased, traded for, or made themselves. It was preserved with salt, smoke, and sun, frequently flavored with black pepper, red pepper flakes, or herbs like sage or juniper. The jerky was tough slices of dried meat with pickles or cheese on the side. It was the original bar snack, long before pretzels or peanuts. And if you were traveling light and needed something for your saddlebag, the barkeeper might wrap a few pieces in cloth and send you on your way. Jerky wasn't just survival food, it was a symbol of self-reliance. You killed it, you cured it, you carried it. And in the West, that kind of food earned respect. 15. Miner's pot pie. In towns where mining and saloons went hand in hand, cooks needed something filling, affordable, and easy to make in batches. Enter miner's pot pie, the hearty meat and dough dish that gave birth to later versions of American comfort food. Unlike the modern creamy variety, this was usually made with rough-cut beef, rabbit, or even squirrel, stewed with onions and root vegetables, then poured into a thick pan lined with pastry dough, when flour was plentiful. Some versions used biscuit dough on top instead of a true crust. Pot pies were baked in shared ovens behind the saloon or beside the blacksmith's forge. They were sold by the slice or served in tin pans, frequently alongside pickles or leftover beans. To the average cowboy or miner, it was as close to a home-cooked meal as they'd ever get. And when you sat down with a bubbling, gravy-filled pot pie and a pint of beer, the whole dusty, dangerous world outside could wait. 16. Cornmeal mush with tallow drizzle. Before grits made their way into southern diners, cornmeal mush was a frontier staple, particularly in saloons that catered to budget-conscious cowboys and railroad workers. This dish was simple, cheap, and surprisingly filling cornmeal cooked low and slow in water or milk until thick and creamy. It was then poured into a tin pan, allowed to cool and set into a firm loaf, and sliced into thick slabs that were pan-fried until golden. Some saloons served it with molasses or sorghum for sweetness, but others went full savory, drizzling it with rendered beef tallow, sometimes mixed with salt and black pepper. Cornmeal mush didn't pretend to be fancy. But for men who hadn't seen a home kitchen in months, it offered warmth, texture, and just enough richness to quiet a growling stomach. It was pioneer polenta, made for boots-on-the-ground survival. 17. Wild turkey and dumplings. When cattle was too expensive and buffalo too rare, saloons in forested regions frequently turned to wild game. And few dishes earned more affection than turkey and dumplings. Made from foraged birds, wild turkeys, not the store-bought kind, this dish started with a long, slow boil to tenderize the tough meat. Once shredded, it was added back to a rich broth seasoned with herbs, onions, garlic, and pepper. The dumplings? Rough drops of flour dough stirred in near the end, puffing up like clouds in a thunderstorm. It was rustic, yes, but when made right, it was deeply satisfying. Cowboys recalled it as the closest thing to Sunday supper back home. And in the right saloon, this meal could even stop a gambler mid-hand. 18. Dried apple pie. Fresh fruit in the West was a luxury, but dried apples? They were gold. Transported by wagon or rail, dried apples were soaked in water to rehydrate and then spiced with cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar to make the filling for early saloon pies. Crusts were made from flour, lard, and water, no butter, no frills, and rolled thick to withstand high-heat cast-iron baking. Some pies were topped, others were open-faced, depending on the available dough. These weren't light, flaky pastries. They were dense, sturdy, and built to travel. But one bite of that sweet stewed apple center, frequently sticky and tart with a smoky edge from the oven, reminded cowboys of orchard seasons they hadn't seen in years. A slice cost a few cents, but for some men, it was worth more than the whiskey. 19. Fried corn cakes, Johnny cakes. Johnny cakes, or fried corn cakes, were the frontier's flatbread. Originally made by indigenous communities and adopted by settlers, cowboys and saloon cooks turned them into a staple. Made from cornmeal, boiling water, and a bit of salt, the batter was dropped onto a hot griddle and fried until the edges curled and the surface browned. Sometimes they were served with sorghum or molasses, but more often than not, they were plain, served as the edible plate under stew or beans. In saloons, Johnny cakes were the bread of choice for quick orders and rowdy patrons. They didn't crumble, didn't spoil, and could be made by the dozen without fancy tools. Some cowboys called them trail flapjacks. Others just called them hot and good. But everyone who worked the range knew if the cook made good Johnny cakes, he was worth following. 20. Cow tongue in brown gravy. Cow tongue might sound strange today, but in the saloons of the Wild West, it was considered a premium cut, flavorful, tender, and perfect for long simmering. It took time to prepare, so only saloons with a proper cook and a steady clientele offered it. The tongue was boiled with spices and onions for hours, peeled, then sliced and seared, before being smothered in a thick, dark gravy made from pan drippings and flour. It was frequently served with potatoes, cornbread, or fried apples on the side. The texture was silky, the taste rich and meaty. It wasn't trail food. It was comfort food for seasoned cowboys, gamblers, or town marshals with a bit more coin to spend. And if you were lucky enough to get the last portion, you didn't share. You savored. 21. Pinto bean chili without tomatoes. Before canned tomatoes and chili powder blends became household staples, cowboys made chili the frontier way, with pinto beans, dried chilies, chunks of beef, and little else. In fact, many early saloon versions didn't use tomatoes at all, particularly in Texas, where red chili stews were built around dried ancho or pasilla peppers ground by hand. The meat was seared in tallow, the beans were soaked overnight, and the entire pot was left to simmer for hours. Some saloon cooks threw in wild garlic, onions, or coffee for extra depth. Others kept it minimalist: beef, beans, heat. This kind of chili was more than a meal. It was medicine, myth, and marketing. Some saloons advertised it as the bowl of red that bites back. Served with a hunk of sourdough or just eaten with a spoon, it warmed the bones and fed the fight. And if you asked for it mild, the barkeep would laugh and slide the pot closer. 22. Bread pudding with whiskey sauce. Not every cowboy had a sweet tooth, but those who did frequently found comfort in bread pudding, a clever dessert made from old biscuits, stale bread, or leftover cornbread soaked in milk, sugar, and eggs. It was the original waste-not dessert, baked until golden and spooned out in soft, spiced portions. Some saloon cooks added raisins or dried apples. Others topped it with a warm sauce, typically whiskey mixed with sugar and butter, poured right over the top before serving. Bread pudding wasn't always on the menu, but when it appeared, it meant someone in the kitchen cared. It was slow food, a dish that required thought and timing, frequently served to travelers who'd been riding for days and just needed something that felt like kindness. 23rd. Fried trout with cornmeal crust. In mountain towns and settlements near rivers and streams, saloons frequently served fresh-caught trout, dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried in pork fat until golden and crisp. Unlike beef or buffalo, fish didn't need long cooking. And when the stagecoach brought in guests from back east, trout was considered a more refined offering. The fish was served whole, head-on, bones intact, sometimes with pickled onions or boiled potatoes on the side. But the key was the crust, salty, crackly, and made from coarse ground cornmeal and black pepper. Fried trout offered cowboys a rare taste of delicacy, particularly when the trout was caught that morning. And for those who spent weeks eating jerky or beans, it felt like high-class dining, even if it came on a tin plate. 24. Gooseberry cobbler. Gooseberries grew wild in the foothills and plains, and for many saloon cooks, they were the secret to a truly Western cobbler. Tart, tangy, and perfect for pairing with sweet biscuit topping. The berries were cooked down with sugar into a jammy filling, poured into cast-iron pans and topped with dollops of thick dough. Some saloons served it with fresh cream, others with just a sprinkle of sugar on top. The flavor was bold, sour and sweet at once, and it was a favorite among old-timers and cowboys who'd grown up foraging. Gooseberry cobbler was a taste of the untamed land itself, baked into something tender and warm. 25. Scrapple. Borrowed from the Mid-Atlantic and Pennsylvania Dutch communities but found in Wild West saloons by the late 1800s, scrapple was a clever, thrifty breakfast food made by mixing pork scraps, liver, cornmeal, and spices into a thick loaf, then slicing and frying it. It was cheap, hearty, and easy to prepare in bulk, which made it perfect for early morning saloon service, particularly in colder months. The crispy crust and soft interior made it satisfying on its own, but many cowboys topped it with molasses, mustard, or eggs. Scrapple may have sounded strange, but it filled bellies and kept men riding. And in a world where nothing was wasted, it was a celebration of resourcefulness wrapped in a crackling crust. So, were these 25 recipes truly served at Wild West saloons? Yes, every single one of them. Because saloons weren't just whiskey joints. They were the first diners, the original truck stops, the only place a cowboy could get a hot meal between dust storms, gunfight, and the long road west. Some of these dishes were strange, some were simple, and some you probably wish you'd sampled sooner. If this video made you hungry for the Old West, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more forgotten American food history. And tell us in the comments, which dish would you try, and which one would you never touch with a 10-foot pole? Now, saddle up timekeepers and click here, because our next video will bring back even more memories of the past.